It was 2 in the morning when the pounding started, a sound so violent it felt like gunfire tearing through the walls of a quiet apartment complex outside Atlanta. The voice that followed was louder still, a man screaming through the door with the kind of certainty that brooks no argument. Inside, a woman named Alicia Johnson sat upright in bed before her mind had even caught up with her body, her heart slamming against her ribs as the words finally registered. Police. Open the door now. She had not even reached for her robe before the door exploded inward, off its hinges, splinters scattering across the hardwood floor like shrapnel. 6 officers flooded into the small apartment, flashlights cutting white beams through the darkness, the muzzles of their service weapons trained directly on her chest. The man in front, broad-shouldered and red, faced with adrenaline, bellowed at her to get on her knees, certain beyond any doubt that he had found exactly who he was looking for. She did not scream. She did not run. She lowered herself slowly to the floor with her hands raised, the cold wood pressing against her knees, while 6 armed strangers surrounded her in an apartment she had paid for with her own 2 hands. The commanding officer kept shouting that she was harboring a fugitive, that she knew exactly where he was hiding, that this would go a lot easier if she just told them the truth right now. Outside, porch lights flicked on one by one as neighbors peered through blinds and cracked doors, some recording on their phones, none of them daring to step outside into the chaos unfolding before them. For a long, suffocating moment, Alicia Johnson was nothing more than a body on a floor, reduced to a suspicion that had walked through her door wearing a badge and a uniform. And then one of the younger officers, sweeping his flashlight across the living room out of habit more than purpose, let the beam land on a jacket draped over the back of her sofa. He froze. The letters across the chest were unmistakable, embroidered in heavy block lettering that caught the light and refused to let it go. FBI, Federal Bureau of Investigation. The room went silent in a way that silence rarely manages, every breath suspended, every weapon suddenly feeling far too heavy in the hands holding it. The commanding officer noticed the shift in his own men before he understood the reason for it, the way confidence drains out of a room the moment certainty cracks. He turned, following the younger officer's flashlight beam to the jacket on the sofa, and for a brief, telling second his jaw simply hung open, without a single word emerging. Behind him, 2 of his colleagues lowered their weapons just slightly, not enough to be obvious, but enough that Alicia noticed immediately from her position on the floor. She did not move. She did not speak. She simply waited. The same patience she had carried through every classroom, every promotion board, and every meeting where someone assumed she did not belong, now carrying her through the most dangerous moment of her adult life. The silence stretched on long enough that one of the neighbors outside finally worked up the courage to call out, asking through the broken doorway whether everyone inside was all right. Nobody answered her. Inside the apartment, 6 armed men stood frozen around a woman they had just learned. In the worst possible way, they had badly, dangerously misjudged. To understand how a federal agent ended up face down on her own living room floor at gunpoint, you would have to go back almost 3 decades to a cracked sidewalk in a forgotten neighborhood where a little girl named Alicia watched her father get handcuffed for a robbery he never committed. She was 6 years old, clutching her mother's leg on the porch, watching 2 officers shove her father into the back of a patrol car while he insisted, calmly and then desperately, that they had the wrong man entirely. The neighbors gathered on their own porches that evening too, watching the same scene unfold, whispering among themselves about a man they had known for years, a man who mowed lawns for elderly widows and coached Little League on weekends without ever asking for a dime. None of that mattered to the officers that night. What mattered was a description that loosely matched, a neighborhood that carried a certain reputation, and a system that often moved faster toward conviction than it ever did toward truth. It took 14 months, and a public defender who actually cared to get him released. 14 months in which the family lost their apartment, their savings, and almost their faith in any system meant to protect them rather than crush them. Alicia never forgot the look on her father's face when he finally walked free, a mixture of relief and something that never fully healed, a quiet wound that stayed with him the rest of his life, like a scar beneath his shirt. She decided, somewhere around her 12th birthday, sitting on the same porch where she had once watched the handcuffs go on, that she would not simply be angry about what happened to her family. Anger, she had already learned by then, burned bright and then burned out, leaving nothing behind but ash and exhaustion. She wanted something that lasted longer than anger, something with teeth, something that could actually change the outcome the next time a man who looked like her father stood accused of something he never did. So, she decided she would understand the system from the inside, learn its rules better than the people who abused them, and one day make sure no one else's father disappeared into a system that saw him as guilty before it ever asked a single honest question. Her mother worried, quietly, that this dream would cost her daughter more than it ever gave back, that a black woman chasing a badge was choosing a harder road than most people ever had to walk. Alicia heard that worry, understood it completely, and chose the road anyway, because somebody, she reasoned, had to walk it eventually, and she would rather it be her than another little girl on another porch decades from now. Her mother, a hospital aide who worked double shifts to keep the lights on after the family lost their savings, never once complained within earshot of her daughter, though Alicia later understood exactly how much that silence had cost her growing up. There were Christmases that year and the next where presents came secondhand or not at all. School trips quietly skipped because the fee never quite fit into a budget stretched thinner than it should have ever needed to be. Alicia noticed all of it even as a child, filing each small sacrifice away alongside the memory of her father in handcuffs, building a private ledger of everything the system had taken from a family that had done nothing to deserve any of it. She promised herself, in the particular way only children make promises, that she would pay all of it back somehow, though she had no idea yet what shape that repayment would eventually take. By the time she reached high school, that promise had hardened into something closer to a plan. College applications spread across her bedroom floor late at night, while her mother slept down the hall after another long shift. She studied criminal justice, on a scholarship that barely covered her books, working 2 jobs through college, while classmates assumed she had it easier than she did because of programs they resented, without ever understanding the cost behind them. She graded papers in a campus library until midnight some nights, then closed a diner counter on weekends, sleeping in stolen hours between shifts and lectures she refused to miss, no matter how exhausted she felt. She finished at the top of her class, then applied to the Federal Academy, where she was one of only a handful of black women in a room full of recruits who openly speculated, sometimes within earshot, about whether she had been let in just to fill a quota nobody asked her opinion on. She outran most of them on the physical tests, finishing courses that broke far larger men twice over, without ever once falling behind the pace she had set for herself from the very first day. She outscored nearly all of them on the exams, her name consistently near the top of leaderboards that some instructors seemed almost reluctant to post. Still, instructors double-checked her work more than anyone else's. Colleagues assumed she needed help she never asked for, and more than one supervisor seemed surprised every single time she proved herself capable again, as though her competence required fresh evidence each and every week. She graduated near the very top of her class, recruited directly into a specialized division that handled long-term corruption investigations, the kind of cases that took years to build and could destroy careers, reputations, and entire departments if done right. Her early years in that division were quiet, methodical, almost invisible by design, the kind of work that rarely made headlines because success looked exactly like nothing happening at all. She learned to read financial records the way other people read novels, finding entire stories buried inside columns of numbers that most investigators glanced over without ever noticing the pattern hiding underneath. Senior agents who had once doubted her, the same kind of skepticism she had faced since her very first day at the academy, slowly began requesting her by name for the cases that mattered most. By the time she moved into that quiet apartment outside Atlanta, Alicia Johnson was no longer simply an agent working her way up through a system. She was the lead analyst on a sprawling, multi-year federal investigation into corruption embedded so deep inside local law enforcement that almost no one outside her unit even knew the investigation existed. And on the night 6 armed officers broke down her front door, none of them had any idea they were about to collide headfirst with the very woman quietly building the case that could end several of their careers. Back in the apartment, The commanding officer was still trying to convince himself that the jacket meant nothing at all, that somehow this had to be a coincidence rather than the catastrophe it was quickly becoming. He told his team it was probably a costume, maybe something she bought online. Anyone could buy a jacket like that, and nobody would ever know the difference between a costume and the real thing. Alicia rose to her feet slowly, brushing the dust from her knees, with a calm that unsettled every single person in that room, far more than panic ever could have managed. She asked, in a voice that did not waver despite everything that had just happened to her, to see the warrant authorizing this raid in the first place. The officer fumbled through his paperwork, his confidence visibly thinning with every passing second, until he finally produced a crumpled page with an address typed across the top in faded ink. She read it once, then again, then looked up at him with an expression that made his stomach drop before she even spoke a single word in response. The address on the warrant was wrong. A single transposed digit separating her apartment from the building directly across the street, where the actual fugitive they were hunting had been hiding for nearly a week without anyone realizing how close they had been. It was the kind of mistake that should never happen, the kind that gets buried in paperwork and quietly corrected before anyone notices the difference between a near miss and a disaster. Except this time, it had already cost 6 armed officers their composure, and nearly cost an innocent woman far more than her dignity on a cold floor in the middle of the night. Alicia asked for her phone, still sitting on the kitchen counter where she had left it before bed hours earlier, and the officers exchanged uneasy glances before one of them finally retrieved it for her without protest. She scrolled briefly, found a single contact saved under a name that meant nothing to anyone else in that room, and pressed call without raising her voice or her temper even slightly. She remained, by far, the calmest person in a room full of men who suddenly looked far less certain than they had felt only 10 minutes earlier, when certainty had still seemed like the only thing they needed. When the call connected, she said only 4 words, simple and unhurried, the kind of sentence that should not have carried any weight at all, and yet somehow seemed to drain the air completely out of the apartment. "This is Johnson." Then she hung up, set the phone down on the counter, and waited, without a single trace of fear crossing her face. 15 minutes later, headlights swept across the parking lot outside, followed by the low rumble of a black Federal Sport utility vehicle pulling to a stop directly in front of the broken door. 2 agents stepped out, dressed plainly, but moving with the unmistakable confidence of people who answered to almost no one in that building, who walked into rooms expecting answers, rather than asking permission to enter them. They did not ask Alicia if she was hurt, did not check whether she needed medical attention, or a blanket, or a single moment to simply breathe after everything that had happened to her that night. They walked straight past the local commander toward her, addressing her not as a victim of a mistaken raid but as a superior whose night had just been needlessly, dangerously interrupted by careless men with loaded weapons. One of them asked, in a flat and almost bored tone, who exactly had authorized this operation, and on what evidence, his eyes never once leaving the local commander's increasingly pale face. The commander opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again, suddenly aware that whatever he said next might follow him for the remainder of his entire career in law enforcement. The senior agent did not wait for a response that clearly was not coming anytime soon. He simply turned to his partner and said 2 words that changed the temperature of the entire room in an instant. "Seal it." Local officers were ordered out into the hallway one by one, their weapons holstered now, their bravado from 20 minutes earlier replaced by something closer to quiet dread. The senior federal agents moved through the apartment methodically, photographing the broken door, the scattered splinters, the exact position where Alicia had been forced onto the floor only minutes before their arrival. They spoke to her quietly in the kitchen, their tone shifting entirely once the local officers were out of earshot, treating her now with the deference owed to someone whose work they clearly respected, and whose safety they clearly should have protected far better than this. She answered their questions calmly, providing details with the same precision she brought to every case file she had ever built, even while standing in the wreckage of her own front door. By the time the sun rose that morning, word had already begun, spreading quietly through both departments, that something had gone seriously, perhaps irreversibly wrong, during what should have been a routine fugitive apprehension. Nobody yet understood just how wrong, or how deep the wrongness actually ran beneath the surface of a single transposed digit on a single piece of paper. What nobody in that apartment understood yet was that Alicia had already begun to suspect something far darker than a simple clerical error made under pressure. A wrong digit on one warrant could be explained away as human carelessness, the kind of typo that happens under stress during a fast-moving, late-night investigation. But over the following days, as she pulled the paper trail from her own secured files, she found that same incorrect address appearing not once, but across multiple documents, embedded in different systems, repeated with a consistency that careless mistakes rarely manage to achieve on their own. Someone had typed it the same way, in the exact same format, on 3 separate occasions over the span of several weeks, each time funneling attention away from the actual fugitive and toward an apartment belonging to a federal agent who happened to live nearby him. That fugitive, it turned out, was not simply a local criminal wanted on minor charges that would fade from headlines within days. He was a key witness in the very corruption case Alicia had spent years quietly building, a man who knew names, dates, and bank account numbers that could unravel an entire network of bribery running through the department itself. Someone had wanted him found by the wrong people, in the wrong way, before he ever had the chance to speak with her directly about what he knew. And someone inside that very department had access to the exact files needed to make that happen without raising a single alarm. She began pulling threads carefully, the way she had been trained to over years of patient, unglamorous work, cross-referencing login times against document edits, comparing internal emails against official case logs that were never meant to align so neatly with chaos. A pattern emerged slowly, the kind that takes weeks to confirm, but only seconds to feel genuinely sick about once the picture finally comes into focus. One name kept surfacing in places it had no obvious reason to appear, attached to system access that should have required far higher clearance than this particular officer actually held. His name was Russell Doyle, a senior officer with nearly 20 years on the force, well-liked, well-connected, the kind of man who got invited to retirement dinners and charity golf tournaments because everyone assumed his record spoke entirely for itself. What it actually spoke for, once Alicia dug deeper into years of buried transactions and quietly altered records, was a years-long arrangement in which Doyle had quietly protected a network funneling stolen evidence and laundered money through small local businesses, skimming a steady percentage for himself while reporting nothing unusual at all to anyone above him. He had been on her radar for months already, flagged in early stages of the very investigation she led, though nothing had been confirmed thoroughly enough to move against him just yet. Doyle, it became clear, had sensed the walls closing in long before Alicia ever knocked on his door with formal questions of her own. He understood, perhaps better than anyone else in that department, exactly how close the federal investigation had come to exposing everything he had carefully built over 2 decades of disciplined, patient corruption. So he did what frightened, cornered men in positions of power often do when they sense they are about to lose absolutely everything they have spent their lives protecting. He manipulated the very system meant to protect the public and turned it instead into a weapon, redirecting an already planned raid toward Alicia's address under the guise of bureaucratic error, hoping the resulting chaos alone might bury her credibility before she ever got close enough to bury him first. If she ended up dead in a botched, poorly coordinated raid, that would be one outcome he could live with for the rest of his life. If she simply ended up discredited, humiliated, photographed on a living room floor in handcuffs by a department that outranked her own authority, that might prove just as useful to him in the long run. Either way, he calculated quietly to himself, the investigation would stall long enough for him to disappear his trail completely and start covering his tracks before anyone connected the dots back to his desk. What he failed to account for entirely was the woman herself, and the very particular kind of fury that comes from someone who has spent her entire life being underestimated by exactly this sort of man. The network Doyle had built over the years operated with a kind of quiet efficiency that made it almost invisible to anyone not specifically looking for it. Evidence quietly reclassified, seized cash skimmed before it ever reached an official ledger, Small businesses used as fronts to launder money that had no legitimate explanation for existing in the first place. He had recruited carefully over the years, choosing officers who were either desperate enough for extra income or cynical enough about the department to look the other way without asking too many questions. Some of those officers genuinely believed they were simply bending minor rules in a system that had already failed them in other ways, never quite allowing themselves to think too hard about where exactly the money came from or who exactly it hurt on the other end. Doyle managed all of it personally, keeping ledgers nowhere near official department records, trusting memory and a small private notebook rather than anything that could ever be subpoenaed by people like Alicia. It was, in its own dark way, a kind of discipline, the same discipline she recognized immediately once she began pulling the threads apart one careful piece at a time. That discipline, ultimately, was also his undoing because a network built entirely on one man's memory and a single notebook collapses entirely the moment that one man is finally exposed. Alicia did not retaliate with anger, because anger was precisely what Doyle expected, and precisely what he hoped would discredit her in the eyes of anyone watching closely. Instead, she moved with the same discipline that had carried her through every doubting classroom and every skeptical supervisor of her entire career. Methodical, patient, and devastatingly thorough in everything she did. She assembled a small task force from her own unit, pulling internal server logs, security footage from department buildings, and email metadata that even seasoned officers had long assumed was completely untraceable by anyone outside their walls. Piece by piece, the evidence accumulated into something undeniable, timestamps lining up with system access, access lining up with edited documents lining up with the exact night her own door was broken down off its hinges. Doyle, sensing the pressure mounting around him, began calling in favors of his own, leaning on old friendships and union connections to slow the investigation and cast doubt on the federal agent making these very specific accusations. Word began to leak quietly to local journalists, framed carefully to suggest Alicia might be overstepping, perhaps even retaliating personally against a respected veteran officer over an unfortunate misunderstanding that had simply gotten out of hand. For a tense stretch of days, it seemed entirely possible that the truth might drown beneath reputation, long-standing connections, and the simple fact that powerful men rarely fall on the very first attempt made against them. Then a young officer named Marcus Reyes, the very man whose flashlight had landed on that FBI jacket weeks earlier, walked into the federal building and quietly asked to speak with someone inside Alicia's unit. He had been carrying something heavier than guilt for days, replaying a conversation in his mind that he could no longer pretend he had simply misunderstood. 2 nights before the raid, he told them, he had walked into a back office to find Doyle on the phone, voice low and urgent, instructing someone on the other end to adjust an address in the system before the warrant request went through official channels. He had not understood the significance at the time, assumed it was routine correction work, the kind of thing senior officers handled without ever explaining their reasoning to junior staff standing nearby. But after watching an innocent woman forced to the floor of her own home, after seeing the FBI jacket and understanding exactly what kind of mistake had nearly gotten someone killed that night, he could not stop thinking about that overheard conversation, no matter how hard he tried. He had, almost instinctively, recorded part of it on his phone, never intending to use it for anything beyond his own private unease, just a habit born from years of quiet distrust within his own department. He played it for Alicia's team in a small conference room, his hands shaking slightly as the recording began, and the moment Doyle's voice came through the speaker clearly, every remaining doubt anyone had about the case evaporated entirely in that room. The recording was not perfect, the audio thin and occasionally muffled by distance, but it was enough, paired with the digital trail Alicia had already painstakingly built, to remove any remaining question of coincidence or simple carelessness. Federal agents moved quickly once the pieces locked into place, securing warrants of their own, this time with addresses triple-checked by people who understood exactly how much one mistaken digit could cost an innocent person. By midnight that same day, vehicles converged on Doyle's home in a quiet, well-manicured neighborhood that had absolutely no idea what kind of man had been living among them for so long without anyone noticing. He answered the door in a bathrobe, the same practiced calm he had used for 20 years to talk his way out of suspicion, except this time the agents standing on his porch were not interested in conversation of any kind. They read him his rights in the same matter-of-fact tone he had once used to terrify others into silence, and for the first time in his entire career, Russell Doyle understood exactly what it felt like to have the system close in around him with absolutely no warning at all. In the days between the recording and the arrests, the federal building hummed with a kind of quiet urgency that only comes when years of patient work finally reach their breaking point. Alicia barely slept, moving between secure rooms filled with monitors and printed timelines, cross-checking every detail against the recording Marcus had handed over, so that nothing could later be dismissed as circumstantial or rushed. Her supervisors, men and women who had watched her build this case from nothing over the better part of 3 years, gathered around a single table to review the evidence one final time before authorizing the next wave of warrants. Nobody wanted to move too fast and hand Doyle's lawyers an opening, and nobody wanted to move too slow and risk losing evidence that frightened men have a habit of destroying once they sense the walls closing in around them completely. Alicia walked them through every document herself, every timestamp, every login that placed Doyle exactly where he should never have been at exactly the moment it mattered most. By the end of that final meeting, even the most cautious voices in the room agreed there was nothing left to wait for, and the order finally went out to move that same night before anyone had the chance to disappear. The arrests that followed extended well beyond Doyle himself, rippling outward through a network of officers, clerks, and local business owners who had quietly profited from years of looked-away evidence and rerouted investigations across the city. Federal agents moved through the department in coordinated waves over the following days, executing warrants that local leadership had no idea were even being prepared against their own people. Several senior officers were placed on immediate leave, their badges and weapons confiscated as cameras from local news stations gathered outside department headquarters, hungry for an explanation that nobody inside seemed willing to offer them just yet. Within a week, the story had spread far beyond Atlanta, picked up by outlets across the country eager to understand how an entire corruption ring had operated undetected for so long inside a respected, well-funded department. Buried in nearly every report was the detail that captured public imagination more than any other piece of the entire story. The woman whose apartment had been raided by mistake, forced to the floor at gunpoint in the middle of the night, was the very same federal agent who had quietly unraveled the entire conspiracy from somewhere deep inside it. People who had seen the leaked footage of her raid weeks earlier, outraged on her behalf without ever knowing her name, suddenly understood exactly who she was and what she had quietly endured long before any of this ever became public knowledge. The grand jury proceedings moved faster than anyone in the department expected. The weight of physical evidence, leaving little room for the kind of drawn-out legal maneuvering Doyle's attorneys had clearly hoped for from the very beginning. Prosecutors laid out years of financial records alongside the recording Marcus had provided, building a timeline so thorough that even Doyle's own lawyer reportedly advised him, quietly and early, to consider a plea rather than risk a trial in front of a jury that had already read every headline about the case. Doyle resisted that advice for weeks, clinging to the same confidence that had carried him through 2 decades of unchecked corruption, certain that his connections would once again protect him the way they always had in the past. They did not. One by one, former colleagues he had once protected began cooperating with investigators, eager to reduce their own sentences by offering testimony against the man who had orchestrated so much of what they had simply gone along with for years. By the time his case finally reached a courtroom, the evidence against him had grown so overwhelming that the judge needed barely 2 days to reach a sentence that would keep him behind bars for the rest of his working life. Outside the courthouse, reporters noted that Alicia did not attend the sentencing, choosing instead to spend that particular morning quietly reviewing files for an entirely different case, already moving forward toward the next piece of work waiting for her attention. A press conference was scheduled outside the federal building roughly 2 weeks after the arrests, packed with reporters, cameras, and city officials eager to distance themselves from the scandal, while still appearing informed about every detail of it. Alicia stood at the podium in a simple navy suit, the same calm composure she had carried through every interrogation room, every skeptical classroom, and every single moment someone had doubted whether she truly belonged exactly where she stood now. She did not open with statistics or legal terminology, though plenty of reporters in that crowd expected exactly that kind of careful, distant language from a federal agent addressing a scandal of this size. Instead, she spoke quietly about a 6-year-old girl who once watched her father get handcuffed on their front porch for a crime he never committed, and how that single memory had shaped every decision she made afterward in her life. She told the room, her voice steady despite the weight behind every single word, that she had not fought this battle for personal vindication or career advancement, though both had certainly followed in its long wake regardless. She had fought, she said, so that fewer people would ever again experience the particular terror of being judged guilty before anyone bothered asking them a single honest question first. The room fell into a silence, rarely achieved by press conferences, the kind usually reserved for funerals or verdicts, rather than scheduled statements from government officials reading from prepared notes. Several reporters lowered their cameras entirely, no longer treating this as simply another headline to file, before an approaching deadline they had been dreading all morning. A few officials seated in the front row, men who had spent entire careers signing off on budgets and policies without ever truly considering the human cost behind mistakes like the one Alicia had survived, looked visibly shaken by what they were hearing now. One reporter near the back asked, gently, what she would say to the officers who broke down her door that night if given the chance to speak with them directly. Alicia paused for a long moment before answering, choosing her words with the same care she brought to every piece of evidence she had ever assembled. She said she did not need an apology from frightened men, following orders built on a lie someone else had carefully constructed for them. What she wanted instead, she said, was a system thorough enough that no other family would ever have to learn what hers had learned on a cracked sidewalk decades earlier. She closed her remarks, not with triumph, but with something closer to quiet resolve, reminding everyone present that justice rarely announces itself with sirens or flashing lights blazing through the dark. More often, she said, it arrives quietly, wearing the face of someone the world had already decided, long before meeting her, to underestimate completely. The applause that followed was restrained at first, almost hesitant, before it grew into something steadier and more sustained, as people in that crowd seemed to realize exactly what they had just witnessed unfold in front of them. Cameras flashed one final time as she stepped away from the podium, her expression calm, her shoulders set the same way they had been the night. 6 armed men burst through her door, expecting to find a criminal hiding inside. She was not hiding anyone that night, and she had never been hiding anything at all, from anyone willing to actually look closely enough to see the truth standing right in front of them. Marcus Reyes, the young officer whose recording had ultimately broken the case wide open, found himself navigating a far more complicated reception within his own department than the national headlines ever captured. Some colleagues treated him as something close to a hero, a man who had chosen conscience over loyalty to a corrupt chain of command that had protected itself for far too long. Others, quietly, treated him with suspicion, the kind reserved for anyone willing to record a superior officer and hand that recording over to federal investigators without hesitation. He requested a transfer not long after the trial concluded, choosing a smaller department 2 counties away, where nobody knew his face from the news coverage, and where he could simply do his job without the weight of being remembered as the man who turned in Russell Doyle. Alicia made a point of calling him personally before he left, thanking him for a courage that had cost him more locally than it had ever cost her, since her own reputation only grew stronger with each passing week, while his had fractured the only professional community he had ever known. He told her, somewhat awkwardly, that he did not regret it, that watching her on the floor of her own apartment that night had taught him something about the difference between following orders and doing what was right. It was, in its own quiet way, one more life. Her case had changed beyond the obvious headlines and courtroom verdicts that followed it. In the weeks that followed, her apartment door was replaced, the splintered frame swapped out for solid oak that closed with a heavy, reassuring click every single night before she went to sleep. Life slowly settled back into something resembling routine. Mornings with coffee on the small balcony, overlooking the quiet parking lot. Evenings, reviewing case files long after most of the city had gone fully quiet around her. Yet something fundamental had shifted. Something that no amount of normalcy could fully erase or restore to exactly what it had once been before that night. Strangers recognized her now in grocery stores and coffee shops, some offering quiet nods of respect as they passed, others simply staring a beat too long before looking away in embarrassment. Children in her old neighborhood, the same cracked sidewalks where her father had once been handcuffed decades earlier, began asking their parents about the woman on the news who used to live just a few blocks over from where they stood. Alicia never sought that kind of recognition, never wanted to become a symbol rather than simply a person doing difficult, necessary work in difficult, complicated rooms most people never saw inside of. But symbols, she was slowly learning, do not always ask permission before they quietly take root in people's memories and refuse to let go. Her father, now in his early 60s and still living in the same small house where she had grown up, watched the press conference twice from his recliner before finally calling her that evening. He did not say much, never one for long speeches, even at the most important moments of his life, but his voice cracked slightly when he told her how proud he was of the woman she had become, despite everything the world had once tried to do to their family. She told him, gently, that none of it would have happened without watching him walk back through their front door all those years ago, battered but unbroken, still believing in something worth fighting for, despite every reason he had to stop believing entirely. They sat on the phone together for a long while after that, saying very little, simply grateful to share space across the distance after everything that had brought them both to this particular evening. It was, in many ways, the conversation she had been quietly working toward since she was 12 years old on that same cracked porch, though she never could have predicted it would arrive exactly like this. On a quiet morning roughly 1 month after the raid, Alicia stepped out of her apartment dressed for work, the FBI jacket pulled snug against the cool autumn air, the same jacket that had once frozen 6 armed officers in their tracks without a single word being spoken. Sunlight spilled gently across the parking lot, catching the embroidered letters across her chest as she walked toward her car without hesitation or fear. Just steady purpose, carried forward by everything she had survived and everything still waiting ahead of her. A neighbor across the way lifted a hand in greeting, and she returned the gesture briefly before sliding behind the wheel and pulling away into the early morning traffic flowing steadily through the city. Somewhere behind her, that apartment, with its new door and its quiet mornings, would remain exactly where it always had been. A small, unremarkable home that had briefly become the center of a story far larger than anyone inside it that night could have ever imagined possible. And somewhere ahead of her, an entire department, still sorting through the wreckage of its own corruption, understood, perhaps for the very first time, that justice does not always arrive announced by sirens or flashing lights cutting through the darkness. Sometimes it arrives quietly, dressed in the very uniform everyone assumed could not possibly belong to her, wearing the face of someone the world had already, foolishly, decided to underestimate long before they ever truly knew her at all.